Hey, true crime fanatics and justice seekers. Before we dive into today's absolutely mind-bending story, hit that subscribe button like your life depends on it. Now, imagine this. It's 1978. Jimmy Carter is president. Saturday Night Fever is still playing in theaters, and somewhere in Massachusetts, a killer thinks they've committed the perfect crime. Two young people, dead on the side of a highway. No witnesses. No fingerprints that match anyone in the system. No DNA technology. Nothing. For 46 years, this case sits in a filing cabinet collecting dust like that exercise equipment you swore you'd use. The families never get closure. The killer walks free, probably thinking there's some kind of criminal mastermind. But here's the thing about criminals. They're not as smart as they think they are. And sometimes, just sometimes, they do something so spectacularly stupid that it defies all logic. This is the story of Timothy Jolie, a man who literally handed the police the key to solving his own 46-year-old double murder case. And he did it by applying for a taxi driver's license. I'm not kidding. This actually happened. So buckle up, because this ride goes from unsolved mystery to "are you kidding me?" faster than you can say. Criminal genius. Let's set the scene. It's June 1978 in Norton, Massachusetts, a quiet suburban town where the biggest excitement is usually the annual Cranberry Festival. The kind of place where people still leave their doors unlocked and kids ride their bikes until the streetlights come on. Mark Harnish, 20 years old, is out with his girlfriend, Teresa Marcoux, who's just 18. They're young, in love, and have their whole lives ahead of them. Mark's driving his pickup truck on what should have been just another evening together. But somewhere along Interstate 495, their night takes a horrifying turn. The next morning, a passing motorist spots Mark's pickup truck pulled over on the side of the highway. Engine off. No signs of mechanical trouble. But something doesn't look right. When police arrive at the scene, they discover something that will haunt them for nearly half a century. Both Mark and Teresa are dead inside the truck, each shot in the head at close range. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Nothing was taken. This wasn't a crime of passion in the heat of the moment. This was cold, calculated, and absolutely brutal. The crime scene tells a chilling story. The truck is positioned like it had been pulled over, maybe flagged down by someone. No signs of a struggle inside the vehicle. No defensive wounds. This suggests the killer either knew the victims or convinced them to stop somehow. But here's what makes this case even more disturbing: the location. Interstate 495 in 1978 wasn't exactly a bustling thoroughfare at night. This was a stretch of road where you could drive for miles without seeing another soul. The perfect place to commit a crime with no witnesses. The killer chose this spot carefully. They knew exactly what they were doing. And for 46 years, it looked like they had committed the perfect crime. Now, this was 1978, remember. No DNA analysis. No digital surveillance cameras. No cell phone records. Police work was still very much about shoe leather, intuition, and good old-fashioned detective work. But the investigators weren't completely empty-handed. Crime scene technicians had managed to lift a partial fingerprint from inside Mark's truck. In 1978, this was the closest thing to a smoking gun you could get. The detectives were cautiously optimistic. Fingerprints don't lie. Everyone's are unique. All they had to do was run this print through the database, and boom, case closed, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. They ran that fingerprint through every criminal database they had access to in Massachusetts. Then they expanded to neighboring states. Then they went national. Nothing. Nada. Zilch. The fingerprint belonged to someone who had apparently never been arrested, never been fingerprinted, and never even gotten a traffic ticket that required printing. This wasn't just frustrating, it was devastating. In 1978, if you weren't in the criminal fingerprint database, you basically didn't exist as far as law enforcement was concerned. The killer had managed to slip through every possible net. The investigation continued for months. Detectives interviewed friends, family members, and coworkers. They checked into both victims' backgrounds, looking for any possible motive. Mark and Teresa were clean. No drug connections, no gambling debts, no secret enemies. They were just two young people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. As the months turned into years, the case went cold. Not because the police gave up, but because they had literally exhausted every possible lead. The fingerprint remained unmatched. The killer's identity remained a mystery. And somewhere out there, Timothy Jolie was living his life, probably thinking he was untouchable. The families of Mark Harnish and Teresa Marcoux, the next few decades were a special kind of hell. Imagine losing someone you love to violence and then having to live with the knowledge that their killer is walking free, maybe living just a few towns over. The 1980s came and went. The 1990s passed. The new millennium arrived. Technology advanced at breakneck speed, but the Harnish-Marcoux case remained stubbornly unsolved. But here's what's fascinating about cold cases. They never really die. They just sit there, waiting. And occasionally, a detective with time on their hands will pull out an old file and take another look. In the early 2000s, Massachusetts State Police began a systematic review of old cold cases. New forensic technologies were emerging. DNA analysis was becoming more sophisticated. Fingerprint databases were being digitized and expanded. The Harnish-Marcoux fingerprint got another chance. Investigators ran it through updated databases, hoping that maybe, just maybe, their killer had been arrested for something else in the intervening years. Still nothing. But they didn't give up. That fingerprint went back into the system, waiting for its moment. Because in law enforcement, you never know when the break is going to come. Sometimes it takes 5 years. Sometimes it takes 50. Meanwhile, Timothy Jolie was living his life in Florida, working various jobs, staying out of serious trouble, probably thinking that if he hadn't been caught by now, he never would be. And then, in what can only be described as a moment of spectacular stupidity, he decided he wanted to drive a taxi. Now, let's talk about irony for a second. Irony is when you spend 45 years successfully avoiding capture for double murder, and then you voluntarily give the police your fingerprints because you want to make $20 an hour driving drunk college kids around town. In 2023, 45 years after the murders, Timothy Jolie walks into a Florida government office and applies for a taxi driver's license. This requires a background check, and you guessed it, fingerprints. Jolie probably thought this was just routine paperwork. He'd been living in Florida for years. He had a clean record there. What could go wrong? Everything. Everything could go wrong. Those fingerprints went into the system, and for the first time in 45 years, the automated fingerprint identification system, which now contained millions more prints than it did in 1978, had something to work with. Somewhere in a Massachusetts police station, a computer made a match. After nearly half a century, that partial fingerprint from Mark Harnish's truck finally had a name, Timothy Scott Jolie. The detective who got that phone call probably thought it was a mistake at first. Cold cases this old don't just solve themselves. But they ran the match again, and every time, the computer came back with the same answer. This is the kind of breakthrough that makes veteran detectives weep with joy. After 45 years of frustration, of dead ends, of families asking for updates they couldn't provide, they finally had their man. But the story gets even better or worse, depending on your perspective. Investigators started digging into Jolie's background. Where was he in 1978? Did he have any connection to the victims? Any reason to be in Norton, Massachusetts on that June night? And what they found was both shocking and completely mundane. Jolie had been living in Massachusetts around the time of the murders. He had no apparent connection to Mark or Teresa. This appeared to be a completely random crime, which made it even more terrifying. For 45 years, this man had been living as a free citizen, working jobs, maybe having relationships, possibly even driving taxi passengers around, never knowing they were sitting next to a double murderer. October 2024. Timothy Jolie, now 71 years old, is living quietly in Clearwater, Florida. Maybe he's watching the morning news, drinking his coffee, planning his day. He's probably completely forgotten about that taxi license application from a year before. Then there's a knock at his door. It's not the mailman. It's not a neighbor asking to borrow a cup of sugar. It's a joint task force of Florida and Massachusetts law enforcement officers, and they're holding an arrest warrant for 2 counts of second-degree murder. Can you imagine that moment? You're 71 years old, probably thinking your biggest worry is whether Medicare covers your medication, and suddenly, you're being arrested for murders you committed when disco was still popular. Jolie's neighbors were probably stunned. This guy had been living among them for years. He was probably the kind of neighbor who waves hello and keeps his lawn neat. The kind of person you'd never suspect of anything more serious than maybe not returning borrowed tools. But that's the thing about cold cases. They don't care how much time has passed. They don't care if you become a model citizen. They don't care if you're a grandfather now. Justice doesn't have an expiration date. The arrest made national news. A 46-year-old double murder case solved by a taxi license application. It sounds like something out of a crime novel, except it's completely, verifiably true. Massachusetts State Police held a press conference, and you could see the satisfaction on their faces. This wasn't just about solving a case. It was about finally giving the families of Mark Harnish and Teresa Marcoux the answers they'd been waiting nearly half a century to hear. The breakthrough came not from brilliant detective work, not from a deathbed confession, and not from new DNA evidence. It came from the suspect, literally volunteering his own fingerprints to the system. In the annals of criminal stupidity, this has to rank somewhere near the top. It's like if D.B. Cooper had parachuted out of that plane successfully, disappeared for 50 years, and then applied for a job at Boeing. This case represents something really important in the world of criminal justice. The idea that no matter how much time passes, some crimes are too serious to forget. For 46 years, the families of Mark Harnish and Teresa Marcoux lived with an open wound. Every birthday, every anniversary, every family gathering was a reminder that their loved one's killer was still out there somewhere, living freely, while Mark and Teresa couldn't. This case is also a testament to the importance of preserving evidence. That partial fingerprint from 1978 was carefully stored and maintained through multiple changes in technology, department reorganizations, and generational shifts in police personnel. Someone, at every step of the way, made the decision to keep that evidence safe. It's also a perfect example of how technology can breathe new life into old cases. The automated fingerprint identification system that caught Jolie didn't exist in 1978. The databases that contained his prints weren't available to investigators back then. Sometimes justice requires patience in the right technological moment. But let's not forget the human element here. This case was solved because investigators never stopped trying. They kept running that fingerprint through updated systems. They kept the case active. They never accepted that Mark and Teresa's murders would remain unsolved forever. And in the end, the killer caught himself by trying to get a legitimate job by following the rules and providing his fingerprints for a background check. Timothy Jolie essentially walked into a police station and confessed to a 46-year-old double murder. There's something poetic about that. The idea that even after all these years, even when he thought he was safe, the weight of his crimes eventually brought him down. And that, my friends, is how a taxi license application solved one of the longest-running cold cases in Massachusetts history. It's a story about patience, technology, and the absolute certainty that criminals will eventually outsmart themselves. If this story gave you chills and made you believe in delayed justice, smash that like button like it's a fingerprint scanner. Hit the subscribe button for more true crime stories that prove reality is stranger than fiction, and ring that notification bell so you never miss an episode.